Remember searching singlemuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by singlemuslim.com. I'm Fahima Mohammed, your relationship coach, and we are going to be hosting you tonight. I am really excited for another really hot topic. And inshallah, I want to also welcome every one of you who are streaming from across Facebook or Twitter or live on Sky Channel 752. I do want to let you know that you can actually participate in the discussion tonight, and that is by calling in live into the studio. The number will be there open throughout the show, and you can do so by calling in on 01924 231 Please remember that the bill payer needs to be advised for your call if you are not paying the bill. Also, if you are going to call us anonymously, please do so on the WhatsApp service, and that would be on 07588355150. We are going to be talking today to a very special guest who is quite passionate about what she does, and I hope that we all can really get some value for tonight. And it's a really interesting topic, and we're going to be talking about preparing for the wedding night. We're going to be doing that with my guest today, who is Amirah Zaky. Assalamu alaikum, Amirah.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a guest on today's show.
No, I am so happy you're here today. And to be honest, it's an absolute pleasure. I know what you do, you're very passionate about. So before we go into the topic, tell me a little bit about you and what you do.
So I call myself a sex educator and vaginismus coach. And inshallah, hopefully at some point today, I can talk a little bit more about what vaginismus actually is in case people are listening and are not sure what it is. Kind of growing up, I didn't expect that I would become a sex educator, but it became, I kind of decided that this was what Allah wanted me to do based on my own personal experiences and based on me really wanting to make a positive impact, inshallah, within the Muslim community.
I really love that, and the fact that you are actually doing this because, you know, at the end of the day, this is something that you are definitely passionate about and you are an expert in. And this is the kind of topic that comes up again and again. There are a lot of Muslim women and men that do find that it is something that they actually find really, really testing on the wedding night. We have all the excitement of the wedding day, the dress, the groom, everything that's happening. And then no one really advises you properly as to what to expect and what to do. Now, before we even start going into that, I'm looking at your title and I'm trying to understand also what that means, which I have looked into, but only recently after discovering yourself. Now, for the audience and everyone that's watching, can you describe and explain and define what is a vaginismus coach? Describe and define that for me, please.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to break it down into the two different parts. We've got the word vaginismus and we've got the word coach. I think most people are familiar with what a coach involves. You've maybe heard of sports coaches, but let me talk first about the word vaginismus. So vaginismus is a condition in which the pelvic floor muscles, these are the muscles that surround the vagina. Both men and women have them, but if I'm talking about a woman in this case, so the pelvic floor muscles surround the vagina in a female, and the condition vaginismus occurs when a woman is trying to have something go into her vagina. It usually happens when this is going to happen the first time, when those pelvic floor muscles start to contract in a kind of automatic, involuntary way, that condition can cause, that situation can cause the condition vaginismus. And what a woman will experience if she's going through vaginismus is she will find vaginal penetration to be quite difficult. She'll find it usually a bit painful. She'll find it, sometimes she'll find penetration completely impossible. But usually the symptoms are that penetration is difficult and painful. So, as I mentioned, a woman will usually become aware of this experience when she's trying to insert something into her vagina for the first time. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of women, especially Muslim women, may experience this condition when they are trying to have penetrative sex for the first time. Having said that, it is possible to kind of know that you may have it. If you've ever tried to insert something into your vagina, whether it's a tampon or whether it's going for a cervical smear test, and you found that inserting those objects was difficult and painful, it's an indication that the woman may be going through the condition vaginismus. It's not very widely known. It's getting better now. More and more people are becoming aware of it. But if it's your first time, that's okay, because we don't often hear the word vaginismus. And that's part of the reason I do this, is because quite a lot of women, regardless of religion, regardless of what country you live in, quite a lot of women do go through this condition. And so we're here obviously talking about preparing for the wedding night. And for me personally, I went through vaginismus, and that's where my journey towards becoming a sex educator started. So that's to describe what vaginismus is. And so I'm a vaginismus coach. Essentially, I coach women on how to overcome vaginismus so that they're able to have penetrative sex in a way where there is no pain, where it's easy and comfortable.
I really appreciate that explanation, and it's really clear right now where exactly this has all started from. The thing is, when we are actually talking about the wedding night, a lot of us, like honestly, I had to firstly learn about this when I came across yourself. Then I took a couple of days of actually trying to pronounce it. So secondly, I just want to say that, we have to be honest and very clear about the education that we have around this. And getting married is a serious step, and it should be a pleasurable one. But as you mentioned, that this condition can actually exist even if you are probably anxious. And I know that it exists more within women, but how important is it that men also need to be aware of this so that they can actually behave and act, or actually perform that intimacy and that act to make their partner comfortable? And can that actually make a difference, or is it something that they cannot actually overcome?
Yeah, great question. So it is extremely important for men to be aware of this condition. Just like it's important for women to know about this condition, it's equally just as important for men to know about this condition. The reason why is, if you think about it, sex is a two-way act. So if you are going to engage in sex with someone, you need to know potentially what he or she may be struggling with. And that goes for both the woman and the man. So a lot of people, men and women, have probably heard of men's sexual dysfunction, such as erectile dysfunction or premature ejaculation. Those are more commonly known. So when a woman is kind of aware that these conditions may exist in her husband, she has that awareness, and then she's able to support him rather than blame him that if he's struggling sexually. She's aware that the condition exists. And so that's the same thing for men. Men need to be aware that this condition, vaginismus, exists. Inshallah, it doesn't happen to your wife, but as I mentioned, it is quite common for women to experience. And so if a man is aware that this condition exists before getting married, and then he potentially ends up struggling with pain, and then he ends up getting married and sees that his wife is struggling and finding sex painful, because he already had the awareness of the condition, he could say, I heard about this condition, why don't we go and speak to a medical professional, make sure we rule out any other symptoms, and then see if we can get a diagnosis for this. So awareness is so important. Educating ourselves is so important. So in answer to your question, it's very important for men to know about it, just like it is for women to know about it too.
I mean, at the end of the day, two people come together in a marriage for so many reasons. And a very, very big part of it, which we cannot ignore and also discredit, is for that intimate connection. So that's why it is quite tense in that moment, knowing if, especially if it's your first time, or even if it's not your first time, you've been married before, it's with a different person. So every experience with a new person will be different, and it can actually make a difference. Now, in your opinion, when would be a good time to actually have these conversations before the wedding night? Because you don't want to be sitting there on your wedding night talking about this. I mean, you could to a certain extent, but you do want to experience that moment where it's a little bit more relaxed and you've actually been comfortable. And a lot of people are shy about this, thinking that it's just going to happen. And they literally wait till that second before they actually go into the room and they are together alone. And that's only the time that they would ever discuss, or even maybe never discuss, or just try and, go into that physical act. So what would be your guidance for two people who are coming together to actually discuss this?
Yeah, great question. So I definitely do recommend that two potential spouses talk about sex before they get married. It doesn't have to be one of the first few conversations when you're kind of initially getting to know someone. It doesn't need to be brought up then. But as things start to get more serious, and as you become more and more likely to marry this person and you feel like this is the right person for you, one of the potential spouses, it doesn't matter whether it's the man or the woman, one of them needs to make the decision to bring up the conversation about sex. Both the man and the woman are naturally potentially going to feel a little bit nervous or a bit awkward to bring up the conversation. The reason that we tend to feel that way is because most Muslims grow up in a household where sex isn't very openly talked about. And so when we are not used to talking about something, it can feel a bit nerve-wracking and a bit awkward to bring up that conversation, especially because I know that a lot of people tell me that they feel worried to bring up that conversation because they think that the potential spouse may think negatively of them. And so that's why I recommend saving the conversation about sex towards, if you have kind of set the date and you know that you're going to be married in a few months' time or in a year's time, in the lead up to that, and you kind of know that you're committed to this person, in the lead up to that, one of you needs to bring up the conversation about sex from a very kind of compassionate, positive way to prevent future problems. Because if you don't kind of find a way to overcome those awkward feelings, and if you don't find a way to bring up that conversation before you get married, unfortunately what we've seen is sometimes it can lead to problems within the marriage.
That is something that we're going to definitely touch on, especially after the break, which we are heading towards in a moment. So please stay tuned, and I have many more questions for you, Amirah. We'll see you shortly after a few moments. Assalamu alaikum.
With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live. With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by SingleMuslim.com. I am really excited to discuss this topic, as there are some serious issues that are actually around the wedding night, and we want to make sure that we cover all aspects of relationships here on British Muslim TV. That's why we are actually raising this topic today, and with a very interesting guest who has the expertise. So if you do want to call in, I know it's really difficult, but we can keep you anonymous, and we can actually have your questions even on WhatsApp. So if you wanted to send in any questions for my guest today, please do so. The numbers are open for the rest of the show, and I look forward to reading some of them later on. Amirah, as we were discussing earlier with regards to, trying to understand when is it the right time to actually speak about this, because it's not an easy topic, even if two people are going to be spending the rest of their lives together. But I guess these kind of uncomfortable conversations are really crucial. It can actually save the fact that you are going to be feeling even more tense and even more nervous. It is something that a lot of people, regardless if they have experience or not from a previous relationship, just being with somebody new can raise various issues. And you've explained very clearly what are the issues that happen, especially with women. Now, when it comes to single Muslims, and obviously it's such a build-up even to this moment, because some people have been waiting for years to get married and be connected intimately with their partner for the first time. And a lot of Muslims right now who are single, who may be watching, and they are struggling in their sexual desire. A lot of us feel that we need to bring up these topics so that we can alleviate some of the struggles and the challenges that Muslim women and men are facing today. So when it comes to your sexual desire, does it differ between men and women? And if so, how? And how would you help them through that desire that they feel, especially when they're not with a partner yet?
Yeah, so I would say in single Muslim men and women, I would say that the level of desire is probably the same. Now, initially, most people would assume that it's men who have a higher level of sexual desire compared to women. But based on my own experience, what I've seen, especially in single Muslims, that both men and women have a similar, roughly similar level of desire for sex. And that's completely normal. That is the way that Allah created us. Now, when it comes to being in a relationship or being in a marriage, sometimes the levels of desire, either in the man or the woman, can change. Sometimes it can get higher, sometimes it can get lower. And there are actually two main different types of desire. They are known as responsive desire and spontaneous desire. And this is what I read about in a book called Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. She says that spontaneous desire is what is the type of desire that we usually see in movies, where you kind of have that instant kind of spark and attraction, and you desire sex in that moment kind of spontaneously. The other type of desire, responsive desire, isn't like what you see in the movies. It's where you need to have the right context. What that means is there needs to be the right environment in place, such as the mental environment, what the person is thinking about, what they're feeling as well. So their mental and emotional environment, but also their physical environment. Those things can then cause them to desire sex, or they need to be in the right context sexually to then start desiring sex. So it's important to be aware of those two types, because if a couple gets married and they see that initially there's a lot of high sexual desire, especially if Muslims are waiting until they get married to have sex, initially there may be that high desire, but then as they go into the marriage and months and years go by, they may notice that one spouse or the other, it's not necessarily gender-based, it could be, and I'll just give the example here of a woman, because this is what I'm seeing a lot from people messaging me. It could be that the wife in that marriage kind of has a lower desire for sex now compared to before. This is very normal, because desire isn't this kind of static thing that you're born with and it never changes. It ebbs and flows. It's very fluid. So if you notice that one spouse, whether it's the wife or the husband, if you notice one spouse having a difference in desire, or perhaps having a lower desire for sex, it could simply be that that person has a more dominant side of responsive desire. And so it's simply about understanding that and thinking, how can I provide the right environment and the right context for my spouse so that they can kind of meet me where I am, especially if I happen to be the spouse that has a higher level of desire. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. In single Muslims, what I'm seeing is desire seems to be very much the same, like level of desire in men and women, but it can change within a marriage, and there are ways to overcome any challenges sexually through communication and collaboration between the spouses.
No, that's very interesting, actually. And it's good that we actually open up that question and that conversation, because a lot of us feel that maybe there's something wrong with ourselves or the other partner. But you have to understand human behavior, and you have to understand that there's different stages that we go through. And there will be different sort of levels of desire, need, and want. And so we need to understand ourselves, our own body, as well as the other person, which is really important in order to have a healthy, active sexual relationship. What are the questions that you could potentially ask your spouse about sex when it comes to preparing for the wedding night? Do you think it's slightly different from a male and a woman's perspective? Do you think that, a woman could initiate it? Or how would you feel, this conversation can actually be processed?
Yeah, I think that there are some similarities between men and women in terms of expectations or fears or desires. And then obviously there are some differences. I think, as we mentioned before, it is really important for the potential spouses to discuss sex in advance before they get married. And some of the questions that they can ask each other are things like, when do you expect to have sex for the first time? And the reason I'm saying that is because even though the topic of today's show is preparing for the wedding night, I think the terminology of the wedding night is such that there's this expectation to have sex for the first time on the actual night of the wedding. So you've just thrown this really big wedding party, and then you get to your place together, wherever you happen to be together, and you are meant to kind of drop everything and have sex immediately. And while that can happen, and there's nothing wrong with it, Islamically, you're now married, it's sometimes a little bit unrealistic to have that big expectation. If you really think about it, most couples after a big celebration are going to be together for the first time, are most likely in a position where they are going to be seeing each other naked for the first time. It's going to feel a little bit awkward. It's going to feel a bit strange. So to expect them to go from 0 to 100 on the wedding night isn't realistic. So I like to say, instead of thinking of it as the wedding night and trying to have sex on the actual night, think of it as of when should we attempt to have sex for the first time, especially if it happens to be something that both spouses haven't done. They've waited until they got married. It's different if, they have had previous marriages before or previous relationships before, and they have some sexual experience, that might be different. But if both spouses are coming together and they don't know what they're doing, like I said, it's unrealistic to expect them to know everything on that first night. And to kind of, a lot of people tell me that they have this kind of performance anxiety. They see sex as a performance where they have to immediately satisfy their spouse. And again, it could go both ways for the man or the woman. And so it's just really about taking a step back and thinking, you've just gotten married, and inshallah you have the rest of your years together. Take it one step at a time, and you don't have to rush. You don't have to have it on that wedding night. But that's one of the questions you can ask, is when are you expecting to have it for the first time? Because some men typically are expecting it on the wedding night, whether it's because of how they were raised culturally or whatever. And so if you have that conversation in advance and you make your potential spouse aware that you don't feel, if you're the woman and you don't feel comfortable to have it immediately on the wedding night, hopefully the potential spouse will be understanding. But that's, like I said, a great conversation to have before getting married, rather than, as you were saying, waiting until the wedding night and trying to have that conversation. Other things that you can discuss are things like beliefs about sex, beliefs about female sexual pleasure, beliefs about sex education in and of itself, beliefs about contraception. There are so many things related to the area of sex. Anything that you have a fear about is something also worth discussing. So if a woman specifically has a fear of sex or a fear of pain, she's feeling awkward and nervous, that is a great thing to say to your potential spouse in advance, so that when it comes to trying to have sex for the first time after getting married, inshallah, the man especially will be a lot more patient and understanding. Because if you don't speak about it before getting married, there's going to be all these expectations, and there's going to be all these things that have gone unsaid, unspoken things. And that's where, unfortunately, we see disappointment and frustration happen, simply because the couple found it too awkward to talk about it. But I think it's so important to just overcome those feelings of awkwardness, and, even make dua to Allah and say, Ya Allah, I have a bit of a fear of this. I'm afraid to talk to my potential spouse, but make dua to Allah, because He will open up the way for you to make it easy, inshallah.
That is lovely. I think you've raised some really important terminology and words that's just, basically springing out of my head right now. And that is the expectation. What about that causing the anxiety and obviously having some sort of like, pre-conversations about it. The thing is, though, do you not think that it can actually not just be awkward, but it could actually take away that spark and excitement if you're actually planning something? Shouldn't it be something natural? And you're not saying like, well, we're not going to do it tonight, but we're going to do it the following. Or even when you look at people that are in a marriage nowadays and they're like, well, we're going to, set aside, date night, and that's when things are going to happen. I mean, does that not take away the romance? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is very dependent on the couple, the type of people each of them is in that couple. It can do initially, but when I'm saying, when I said you should ask the question, when do you expect to have it? It's just for you to have an idea of, is there an expectation from the man or a woman to have sex immediately? And if so, have discussions about that. Do you both feel ready mentally and ready physically? Do you have all the right knowledge to go into that experience, especially for the woman? Do you know about your sexual anatomy and your pelvic floor muscles to have an experience where first time sex, especially first time penetrative sex, is a comfortable situation. But it's not about necessarily saying like, okay, we've gotten married today on a Saturday and on the Wednesday we're going to try and have sex. It's not about setting an actual date. It's more about having that kind of rough ballpark of, I would love to try a couple of weeks after we've gotten married. Maybe it doesn't have to be on the honeymoon itself. Like a lot of people do expect to have sex on the honeymoon, but maybe it can just be, especially if you've kind of got.
Well, we'll definitely be picking that up, Amirah, in a few moments, as we are actually going to be coming into a break shortly. And you've again opened up so much more questions that I can't wait to actually ask you in a few moments. I just want to say, please do stay tuned. We have so much more to learn from Amirah tonight. And inshallah, if you do have any questions, please send them across and I will read them out for you. And I just want to also say thank you so much for tuning in. And we will see you after a very short break, and grab a cup of tea or coffee and we'll catch you on the other side.
With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live. With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by SingleMuslim.com. We're having a really hot topic discussion tonight, and it's so vital. It's such an amazing period and time of your life, and the most special night is the wedding night. So I'm here with Amirah, asking her loads of questions, trying to make sure that we give as much information to everyone that's watching. And if there's anything that you would like to add, please do call in or send us a message. Amirah, we were talking about obviously the romantic side of having that wedding night feel special and be special. Do you think it's mainly for a man to be aware of not just themselves, but actually the women, how they're feeling, how they are mentally, physically, emotionally? What would you advise and guide men for them to make it special on their side and their part first for the women?
Yeah, great question. So I think this all starts from a man really taking it upon himself to educate himself as much as he can about sex from good sources. So sources that are not against Islam, sources where, you educate yourself about the sexual rights of both the husband and wife, but really seeing sex as something that is holistic. Sex is not just a physical act. It's not just something that a man or a husband can demand of his wife and expect to happen immediately, because that doesn't come from the Sunnah. Sex is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a two-way act. So it's involving another person, your wife, who is a whole being, who has emotional needs, mental needs, and physical needs. So it's not just about your needs being higher than her needs. It's about you two are equal in the sight of Allah. And however you expect sex to go, it cannot happen in a way that goes against Islamic guidelines and principles, or goes against Islamic spirituality. It's also really important to think about our example in our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how he went about having sex with his wives. So it's really about educating yourself as much as possible about sex in advance. And what's really important is finding authentic hadith about this. So one of the authentic hadith is where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that you should not approach your wife like an animal, where you just kind of expect sex to happen immediately without any foreplay. And our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would highly recommend foreplay being things like kisses and sweet words. That was what the hadith was about. And so when you think about that, it's really important to know that there are differences in men physiologically and differences in women compared to men physiologically and hormonally, and it's important to understand that, you know, if you are wanting to have sex with your wife, you need to see her as a whole being, and ask yourself, what is it that I need to do to turn her on? What is it that I need to do to feed into her desire for sex, to cause her to be aroused? Because that's going to then work in your favor if you're the one wanting to have sex. So it is important to see your wife holistically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and really pay attention intuitively as to how would Allah like me to approach this act of worship, because that's the way we need to be seeing sex. Is we need to be seeing sex as an act of worship within our marriage. It's also a form of charity. And so just like when we do other forms of worship, our intention is so important. That applies to sex as well, because this is an act that you are doing and Allah is watching you. So it cannot be oppressive or manipulative or forced or harmful or painful. It needs to be on the basis of having compassion and love, mutual respect, mutual understanding, and something where you can both collaborate and communicate about it, so you are supporting one another. Because the way you engage in sex is really a reflection of your relationship with your spouse and a reflection of your marriage.
That is so interesting, and I'm glad that you raised what you have. It's so important that we do understand the rights and the responsibilities. So I do have a question on WhatsApp, actually, which I'm going to be reading out soon. But at the same time, I just want to also say that thank you so much for actually sending this in. The question is, from my understanding, would you agree it's important to be clean shaven in the private areas for preparing for the wedding night, as this is a topic for today? I do agree we all want to be desired, feel loved. So what's your response to that, Amirah?
Yeah, so it comes down to personal preference, really. If it's going to make you as the woman, I'm assuming that this is a woman asking, correct? Yeah,
I'm not sure. It's an anonymous, so I'm not sure. I don't know who it is.
So
Yeah, but we can take it from both sides.
Yeah, it can go either way, whether it's the man or the woman. If that's going to make you feel more comfortable and relaxed, you know, being clean down there isn't necessary. But in terms of being shaven, that needs to come back to what the hadith has been narrated, that it does need to be trimmed. There's a kind of certain rough size measurement as to how long we should be able to grow our pubic hair and how much it needs to be trimmed. But if you're talking about kind of being fully shaven down there, so that there's no more hair down in your private area, then that comes down to personal preference. It also comes down to what both spouses like, and that you may not know initially. It may come after, you know, being engaged in sexual activity with your spouse for a while. One spouse might actually prefer a little bit of hair because it might be a bit less prickly, for example. So it really is kind of down to personal preference for both the man and the woman. But in terms of, if you mean like first time sex or the kind of wedding night experience, whether it's necessary to be fully shaven down there, it's not necessary. It comes down to your preference. If that would make you feel more sexually attractive within yourself, then absolutely it's something you can go for.
Thank you for that. And I hope that answers your questions. And thank you for sending that through. That actually comes on quite nicely to my next question. With regards to the different sexual desires that we do have for one another, obviously, we're not going to know straight away. And again, even if we did have experience from a previous relationship, everybody is different. How would you have someone maneuver around that? And how much time do you think that someone should take? And isn't it important that they do take that time to not just be full on thinking that, yeah, we're going to be there for each other in the best way possible from the beginning, and there's going to be complete satisfaction and fulfillment from both sides? And how important is that for individuals to understand that when they are together, that it takes time to explore, it takes time to understand each other's desires, and it does change over time as well. How would you sort of advise that, Amirah?
Yeah, great question. So I think it definitely is going to be, it varies from couple to couple. Some couples may go into a marriage in a situation where they've never had sex before, either of them, and they both have, received a good level of sex education. They feel confident mentally and physically to have sex for the first time on the same, like on the actual wedding night itself, or a few days later. Other couples will need a bit more time. They may need a few weeks to get to know each other better, especially if they kind of met in a very traditional way, where maybe they didn't have that many conversations before getting married, or maybe they always had someone else present in the room when they were getting to know each other, so maybe they couldn't have this conversation in advance. So now that you are married and you are alone together, it is about taking time and really paying attention to your spouse's needs. And again, this can go both ways. And so when it comes to that as well, what I want to say is, if you think about it, if you are getting to know each other before marriage in a kind of traditional Islamic way, where you are not touching hands, you are not doing any kind of kissing or sexual activity before the marriage, when you are finally married, I want you to think of it as though you are kind of now dating each other in the kind of traditional Western way. And if you think about it, most people who date in the traditional, in the Western way, sorry, not traditional, most people who date in the Western way typically don't have sex immediately. They do the dating period for a few weeks, a few months. That's kind of the same as now that you're married, you can date each other. You don't have anyone else there with you in the house or in the room. You can go out to movies and restaurants, or have dates in your home. So see it that way, as it doesn't need to be immediate. It is going to take time to figure out what turns on your spouse, and figure out what helps you to desire sex. So take your time with it, and really from the very beginning, keep open lines of communication with your spouse, especially when it comes to something like sex.
I think that's lovely what you just suggested, actually. And I never really thought of that before when you first get married, because a lot of us, we do not have that way of getting to know your partner beforehand, and it isn't a traditional way. So it's a really good step to start off that marriage, as in the halal dating, when you're actually married, and take your time to really get to know each other, especially in a physical way and the intimate way, and then, move forward from there. I think that's a really, really good sort of like tip to move into a new marriage, and hopefully that honeymoon period will last even longer. So when it comes to the things that men and women need to know before first time sex, does it differ, and what are the differences, if there are any?
Great question. So there are many things that both men and women need to know that are the same, and then there are a few slight differences. So I'll talk about the things that both men and women need to know, and then I'll kind of go into the gender-based differences. In terms of what men and women need to know about your sexual anatomy, I would say more so for women, actually, because for men it's quite easy to see, whereas for women their sexual anatomy is a little bit more kind of internal and hidden, which will require them to possibly use a mirror to look at themselves down there. For any women listening, I highly recommend, before you get married, use a mirror, preferably like a handheld mirror or even a full-length mirror, it doesn't matter. But spend some time looking at yourself down there, and it's probably going to feel a bit awkward if you've never done this before. I'm not here telling you to do anything haram. You are simply looking at a part of your body. Just like I am able to look at my hand now, this hand that Allah created, I'm advising you to look at yourself down there and figure out the different parts of your sexual anatomy. When it comes to men, this is something that they don't need to necessarily look at, but be aware of the fact that if you've ever been exposed, and in the society we live in now, it's very hypersexual. that it's very hypersexualized. There are images of sex out there. You may have seen what a vulva looks like. And I'm using the word vulva because that's the proper terminology. Most people tend to use the word vagina. You may have an expectation of what your wife's vulva should look like. Try and get rid of any expectations, because the images you've seen out there are designed for entertainment, and they're usually airbrushed. So don't expect your wife's sexual anatomy to look the same. When it comes to a woman, I definitely recommend looking at yourself down there with a mirror, making sure you know the different parts, making sure you know where your clitoris is, making sure you know where the opening of your vagina is, because believe it or not, so many women tell me that they get married and then they try and have penetrative sex for the first time, but they don't actually know where the opening of their vagina is. And so when you think about it, it's going to be very difficult for you to do the act of penetrative sex if you don't know where the opening of the vagina is. So that's one of the things.
Well, I think we will definitely continue this conversation after the break, and you've definitely given us a lot of food for thought right now. So hopefully we will see Amirah at the other side of the break, and we'll have much more questions for her. And I hope for you to actually stay tuned and stay exactly where you are. And hopefully we will be catching you with more questions. Do put forward your questions and I will read them out. Assalamu alaikum.
With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live. With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by SingleMuslim.com. Welcome to the final part of the show, and it's gone by so quickly, and I want to go straight into these questions as Amirah is on the other side taking all the questions, and hopefully you are definitely getting some value, because I certainly am. Amirah, we're going into the anatomy and understanding how men and women should know themselves and the other partner, and how important it is to actually have these kinds of information and knowledge. What are the myths that actually exist around, intimacy? And because I've heard quite a few, and people coming up to me speaking in a particular way, saying that these are the kind of things that happen. And, it's really quite astonishing as to the information, even with so much advancements out there, there are so much lacking of the actual happenings around, the first time when you are intimate with each other. So what have you heard that you would like to maybe eradicate tonight?
Yeah, so one of the biggest myths that is out there regarding sex is the myth that first-time sex is meant to be painful for a woman. That is a very common myth out there, and it's very damaging for a woman to be told that and for a woman to believe that, because it is that myth itself that is one of the biggest causes of the condition vaginismus that I was talking about, in which a woman finds penetrative sex very difficult and very painful. So I'm here to tell you, for everyone listening, whether you're a man or a woman, first time sex is not meant to be painful for a woman. And I really want you to start believing that. And the reason I know this is because I've experienced both. I tried to have sex for the first time with my husband, and it was very painful, so much so that we weren't able to actually have sex. Penetration was not possible because of how painful it was. And after overcoming the condition vaginismus and finally being able to have proper sex for the first time with my husband, I saw for myself that there was no pain at all. And so that is an indication that if you are here listening to this, it is so important to educate yourself in order to prepare yourself mentally and physically for first time sex. When I say physically, the education you need is around things like your sexual anatomy that I was talking about, but also around knowing about your pelvic floor muscles. Especially in women, it's so important to know how these muscles function and what it feels feels like when these muscles are contracted and relaxed. Because if you are trying to have vaginal penetration, it is important to know how to get your pelvic floor muscles to be relaxed, because this is what will allow your husband's penis to penetrate the vagina without any pain, and for it to be a lot more comfortable. Another myth that's out there is regarding the hymen. There is this big myth that the hymen is an indicator of a woman's virginity. That is not true. There are women who have never had sex before, have never had penetrative sex before, but their hymen is not intact. And this is the case for so many women. But when you think of, when you educate yourself about the hymen, you come to find that the hymen is a very thin membrane that kind of lines the opening of the vagina. And in the majority of women, especially when they are of age where they are about to be married, in most women, that hymen is not intact, because as she went through the different stages of her life, through any kind of physical activity, the hymen starts to kind of break down and disintegrate and starts to stretch. And so this idea that the hymen is an indicator of virginity is false. And actually, the hymen itself hasn't been talked about in Islam. It's not talked about in Hadith. So we need to come away from this kind of purity culture and patriarchal culture that a woman's hymen has to be intact in order to prove her virginity. The other myth related to that is that all women are meant to bleed when they have sex for the first time. This is a complete myth. There are many women, again, who have never had penetrative sex before, and then when they have penetrative sex for the first time, they do not bleed, and this is completely normal.
I'm glad you've actually said all of that, because those are the very, very common myths that it is out there, and it actually has caused a lot of discourse and disruption and interruption into that first night of marriage, and even to cause, second guessing the actual credibility of that person. So I'm really happy that we actually did address that. I know it's a really obvious question, but I think it's really important that we do understand, what is the purpose of sex in a marriage?
So I see that the purpose of sex are three main things. The purpose of sex within a marriage is first and foremost worship. The second purpose of sex is intimacy. And the third purpose of sex is pleasure. And it's possible for all three of those to be in place. And that, I believe, is the goal of sex. The goal for sex in terms of the way Allah intended for sex to be within a marriage. So worship, intimacy, and pleasure. Therefore, if you prioritize that in any sexual experience with your spouse, inshallah, you will find that experience to be really positive and really enjoyable, and something that will continue to strengthen your relationship within your marriage, inshallah.
And what is the truth about the wedding night? Let's get straight into it before we are coming towards the end of the show, but let's just get into the main idea of what is the truth about the wedding night.
So the first thing I want to say is that you do not need to have sex on the wedding night. You don't need to have first time sex on the wedding night. You can if you want to and if you feel ready mentally and physically, but you don't have to. There is nothing in Islam that says you must have sex on the wedding night. Like I said, you can if you're ready, but if you want to wait a little bit, that's also perfectly fine. And it's something I would actually recommend is, if it's both of your first times, give it a little bit of time to get to know each other, to kind of build up your confidence around it. So that's the kind of main message around the wedding night. Do as much as you can before getting married to educate yourself about your bodies and about sex itself and about your sexual rights and about how Allah wants us to enjoy sex within our marriage. Do as much education beforehand, but also bear in mind that sex is a lifelong journey, and sex education should also be a lifelong journey.
Thank you so much for that. We do actually have a question for you, Amirah. The question is, firstly, are you married now? And also thank you for the advice and the input. They are stating that because there is a party culture and hookup dating worldwide, when it comes to partying, I avoid this. However, as we spoke about communicating, and it's important for a relationship and marriage, Amirah, you say we shouldn't be worried about our libido. Any advice for me to not be ashamed about mine?
So the thing I want to say is, in the Quran, Allah describes sexual desire amongst the prophets. So there is a surah, as we know, Surah Yusuf, where he describes sexual desire. Most people, when they read that surah, they kind of understand that it's just the woman who has desire, and they falsely assume that the prophet didn't have any desire. But when you actually read the ayahs, some of the ayahs say that Prophet Yusuf in the Quran, he is saying to Allah, Ya Allah, protect me from this, because if you do not protect me, I will succumb to this. That means that Prophet Yusuf did feel some desire, some sexual attraction, and so he asked Allah to protect him. That the reason I'm bringing up that specific ayah in regards to libido, in regards to desire for sex, whether you're a man or a woman, is simply to say, if Allah created prophets with sexual desire and prophets were human, we also are going to be experiencing sexual desire. Sexual desire is part of our human experience. Allah created us with our sexuality. So if you desire sex, there's nothing to be ashamed of. The desire for sex is a feeling. Allah is not judging us based on our feelings. Allah is judging us based on our intentions and our actions. So if you're in a situation...
Thank you, Amirah. Before we continue, I just want to make sure that we do take this caller, because we have come towards slightly the end of the show, but we do have a caller online. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. So I just wanted to say, when you're talking about sex, if you rewind back in time, I think sex was only there for when back in the days people wanted children, and that's why they done it. Now it's just went too far. People are just thinking it's pleasure and desire. I think that's just been extreme. It was just for children, and maybe now it's just every time people want sex, which is crazy, man. And what about lesbians and other gays? Is it not different sex for them as well? Everyone's entitled to whatever way they want it, I suppose. Anyway, Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much for that comment and that question. I really appreciate you calling in. What's your thoughts on that, Amirah?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. My belief is that Allah created sex, yes, for procreation in order to have kids, but it isn't the main purpose, because if you think about it, we have this desire for sex. So if we have a desire for something, it is one of our needs to be able to engage in intimacy and connection with our spouse. So if you are going into a marriage expecting to only have sex when you want to procreate, and both spouses are happy with that, then that's fine. But in my experience, most spouses don't just want sex for procreation. They want sex for pleasure, for intimacy, and for connection. So as the caller is saying, it does definitely need to come down to the couple. If a couple just wants to have sex for procreation, that's their choice, as long as they're happy with that. But like I said, the majority of couples out there want to be able to engage in this beautiful experience. There are also some narrations that say that Allah created sex as a taste of what Jannah is going to feel like, a small taste on earth of the immense pleasure that we will experience, inshallah, in Jannah.
Thank you so much so far for everything that you've shared. Unfortunately, we have come towards the end of the show, but I want to give you the opportunity to say some final thoughts with regards to this topic. We only have a couple of minutes, but I really want to give you the opportunity to sort of add anything that I haven't asked you, which you think, which is really important for our viewers that are watching today, to have like some last minute thoughts and takeaways on this topic for today.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to say is I am really passionate about sex education, and the main reason is because I have found personally that the more I educate myself about sex and divine sexuality, meaning the sexuality that Allah has instilled within us, the more I educate myself about my body, I am constantly in awe of Allah's creation, how He created us as humans. So I am really using, inshallah, my education of sex, because even though I'm a sex educator, I'm constantly educating myself about sex. I am using that as a form of worship, because the more I educate myself about sex, the closer I feel to Allah, the more I feel like I know Allah. I really get to see just how generous Allah is, because He created this act of sex that is very pleasurable when you know what you're doing. And it makes me feel like, wow, Allah is telling me sex is worship, so He's rewarding us for doing this, but He's also allowing us to feel pleasure for that act of worship.
Thank you so much, Amirah. You have shared so much insights tonight, and I really appreciate this. It's not an easy topic. If anybody do want to reach out to you, please do so. Amirah is a fantastic coach, especially on this topic. And honestly, I've had so much more questions, which I didn't even have a chance to finish, but you've given us so much food for thought so far. Thank you, Amirah, for being with us tonight. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and watching. And I want to say that I really do appreciate your time and you tuning in and supporting us. Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
million members searching, singlemuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.